Stop for a second. Before we go any further, I need you to understand something about what you're about to see. Because most people who visit Pompeii, over 3 million tourists every year, walk through the ruins, take their photos, read the plaques, and leave thinking they understood it. They didn't. What they saw was the skeleton, the husk, the negative space left behind after everything that mattered had been stripped away by time and weather and 2,000 years of slow disintegration. What they did not see, what almost nobody sees, is the city, the actual city, with its noise and its color and its smell and its 15,000 residents moving through streets so precisely engineered that the drainage system still functions today, with its painted walls and its marble temples and its street food vendors and its underground heating systems and its brutal entertainment complex and its deeply uncomfortable social architecture that most tour guides quietly skip over. That is what we are going to see today. And here is the thing that should make you lean forward right now. Pompeii is not primarily a story about a volcano. The eruption is the ending. But the story, the real story, the one with implications that reach directly into the present, is about what was already happening inside those walls before Vesuvius made its move. What that city reveals about wealth and poverty and power and leisure, and the specific way that advanced civilizations organize human inequality, is a lesson that no amount of lava could bury permanently. The date is October 24th, 79 AD. It is morning. The city is alive. And we have roughly 6 hours before everything changes forever. Let's go inside. You approach from the south. From the Bay of Naples, where merchant ships are unloading cargo at the harbor, wine amphorae, bolts of fabric, exotic animals destined for the amphitheater, grain from North Africa. The smell reaches you before the city does. Salt water, fish, the sharp fermented punch of garum, the fish sauce that Pompeii produces and exports across the Roman Empire in quantities that make it one of the city's primary industries. Pompeii's garum, made from mackerel and other fish, packed in salt and left to ferment in large stone vats, was considered among the finest in the Roman world. Archaeologists have found Pompeian garum jars in excavations as far away as modern France and Spain. You enter through the Marine Gate, and this is the first thing that AI reconstruction corrects in your mental image of Pompeii. The gate you see in ruins today, weathered stone, eroded surfaces, stripped of everything decorative, bore almost no resemblance to what stood here in 79 AD. The gate was painted, bright colors, red ochre and white lime, and traces of gold on the architectural details. It had working wooden doors, iron reinforced, wide enough for carts loaded with commercial goods. Guards were posted at the top in a small watchtower. The city did not begin with ruins. It began with an entrance that announced, deliberately and unmistakably, that you were entering a place of consequence. Pompeii was not a village. It was not a provincial backwater accidentally preserved by geological accident. It was a prosperous, mid-sized Roman city with a sophisticated economy, a complex social hierarchy, a fully functioning legal system, a developed entertainment industry, and urban infrastructure that most European cities would not match for another 1,500 years. Its population in 79 AD was somewhere between 11,000 and 20,000 permanent residents. Historians debate the exact figure, plus a substantial floating population of sailors, traders, travelers, and seasonal workers that could push the daily population significantly higher. The streets inside the Marine Gate slope upward. They are paved with massive, irregular blocks of volcanic basalt. Lava stone, locally abundant, extraordinarily durable. Fitted together with a precision that required skilled engineering. Look at the surface of those stones, and you can read the city's circulation patterns directly. Deep parallel grooves worn into the basalt by thousands of iron-rimmed cartwheels, running in consistent tracks that tell you exactly where the commercial traffic moved, how heavy it was, and how many decades of use it took to cut those channels into stone. On either side of the street, raised stepping stones project from the curb at regular intervals. These are not decorative. Roman streets served simultaneously as roadways and as drainage channels. Household waste, animal waste, runoff from food preparation, liquid refuse of every description. All of it flowed through the street gutters. The stepping stones allowed pedestrians to cross without contact with the surface. The engineering was deliberate, and the public health rationale was understood. Romans did not have germ theory, but they had centuries of empirical observation about the relationship between contaminated water sources and illness, and their urban planning reflected that knowledge in practical ways. The street grid is immediately legible. East-west arteries called decumani, north-south streets called cardines, city blocks called insulae, islands, packed with layered mixed-use density that modern urban planners would recognize immediately. Ground floors, commercial. Shops opening directly onto the street with wide doorways, no glass, wooden shutters that fold back during business hours. Upper floors, residential. The boundary between work and home in Pompeii was architectural rather than geographic. You lived above your business or immediately adjacent to it. The separation of residential and commercial that modern American cities enforce through zoning codes, a development of the 20th century, would have made no sense to a Pompeian property owner. The walls of the buildings lining the main streets are covered in writing. Not graffiti in the modern dismissive sense. Writing. Political endorsements. Over 2,800 surviving electoral notices, painted in red on white backgrounds, supporting candidates for local office, signed by specific professional guilds, neighborhood associations, and individuals. One of them reads, "The fruit sellers unanimously urge the election of Marcus Holconius Priscus as duovir." Another, "Vatia for Edile," supported by the late-night drinkers. The casual, self-deprecating political humor of 79 AD. There were advertisements, rental notices, announcements of upcoming gladiatorial events with the names of the fighters and the number of pairs scheduled to fight. Love declarations, insults, a recurring category of philosophical observations that ancient graffiti scholars describe, without exaggeration, as surprisingly sophisticated. One inscription found on a Pompeii wall reads, "Nothing can last forever. Suns can set and rise again. But when our brief light sets, we must sleep through one unending night." That was written on a wall in a Roman city 2,000 years ago, by someone who had no idea the volcano was coming. You are now standing in the Forum. Take a moment with this. Because the Forum is where the gap between what tourists see today and what actually existed in 79 AD is most dramatic, most disorienting, most important to correct. What visitors see now? Stone stumps, a mostly empty rectangular space, some partial column bases arranged around a flat expanse of paving stones. The outline of buildings suggested by foundation courses and lower wall fragments. Impressive in its scale, largely illegible in its original function. What was here in 79 AD? One of the most architecturally elaborate civic spaces in the Roman world, outside of Rome itself. The Forum was 157 meters long and 38 meters wide. On three sides, it was enclosed by a two-story colonnaded walkway, a covered portico of Doric columns on the ground floor, Ionic columns above, creating a shaded commercial and social promenade that ran the entire perimeter. The pavement was white travertine limestone, polished smooth. The columns were stuccoed and painted. Honorific statues of emperors, of local benefactors, of gods stood on pedestals throughout the space. The entire complex was closed to wheeled traffic. It was a pedestrian zone, which in a Roman city where donkey carts and horse-drawn vehicles dominated the street network, was a deliberate luxury. The Forum was where you came when you wanted to move at the pace of human conversation, rather than commercial transit. On the north end, the Temple of Jupiter. This is the most important thing to reconstruct correctly, because the ruins today give almost no sense of the original visual impact. The temple sat on a high podium, raising it above the forum level. Its columns were 30 feet tall. The triangular pediment above the colonnade carried sculptural reliefs. The inner sanctuary, the cella, housed a massive cult statue of Jupiter, the king of the Roman gods, probably painted and gilded. The whole structure was oriented to align with the summit of Vesuvius, visible on the northern horizon, a coincidence of civic planning and geography that took on a different meaning on October 24th, 79 AD. The temple had been damaged significantly in the earthquake of 62 AD, a seismic event that devastated much of Pompeii 17 years before the eruption. The city spent those 17 years in a state of ongoing reconstruction. The Temple of Jupiter was still being repaired when Vesuvius erupted. Scaffolding was found in the ruins. Archaeologists found building materials stockpiled near the foundation. The city was, in a very real sense, mid-renovation when it died. A detail that adds a specific quality of human tragedy to the archaeological record. These were people actively rebuilding their future who ran out of time. To the left of the Temple of Jupiter, the Temple of Apollo. Older than Roman Pompeii itself, originally built by the Oscan and Samnite cultures that inhabited this region before Roman colonization. The Greeks who traded on this coastline in the 5th century BC contributed to its construction. By 79 AD, it had been thoroughly Romanized in its decoration, while retaining its ancient ground plan. In the courtyard stood a bronze statue of Apollo drawing a bow, a copy of the original, which had been removed to Rome. A sundial stood in the courtyard near the altar. Priests moved through the colonnaded walkway in white robes. The smell of sacrificial smoke was a constant presence in the forum air. To the right, the basilica. This word will mislead you if you approach it from a modern context. The basilica was not a church. Christianity would not reach Pompeii in any organized form for another century at minimum. The basilica was a courthouse, a legal and financial processing center. A massive rectangular hall, roughly 55 meters by 24 meters, divided internally by rows of tall columns into a central nave and side aisles. At one end, a raised tribunal where a judge presided. Along the walls, the offices of lawyers and notaries and money changers. This was where contracts were signed, disputes were adjudicated, debts were formally recorded and collected. It was the beating institutional heart of Pompeii's commercial life. And on the morning of October 24th, 79 AD, it was packed. Behind the forum, accessible through a colonnade, the Macellum, the main food market. Reconstruction reveals a large rectangular courtyard with a covered central structure, a tholos, a circular roofed pavilion supported by columns, beneath which fish vendors operated from marble-topped counters. Fish bones and scale impressions found in the excavated drain beneath this structure have allowed marine biologists to identify the species sold here: sea bass, mullet, sea bream, eel, oysters, sea urchins. Around the perimeter of the Macellum, individual shops sold vegetables, bread, dried fruit, wine, olive oil. The walls of the market were covered in frescoes depicting food, painted still-life images of fish, fowl, fruit, and vegetables that functioned simultaneously as decoration and as menu boards. The noise in the Macellum was considerable. Vendors calling prices, buyers haggling, the thud of cleavers on butcher blocks, the splash of water from the central fountain that kept the fish fresh. Latin spoken in at least 3 regional dialects: Campanian, Roman, Oscan, with Greek threading through the commercial conversation of the harbour-adjacent neighbourhood to the south. Pompeii was not a monolingual city. It sat at a cultural and commercial intersection where multiple Mediterranean traditions overlapped, and its street life sounded like it. Step off the forum and walk west. The residential streets tell a story that Roman history textbooks consistently underrepresent. The House of the Faun occupies an entire city block. 3,000 square meters of private residential space in a city where most people lived in rooms smaller than a modern American studio apartment. This was the home of one of Pompeii's wealthiest families. The specific owner in 79 AD is debated, but the scale of the property communicates its social category without ambiguity. This was the 1%. Not metaphorically, literally. Reconstruction reveals what the property actually looked like from the inside. You enter through a narrow street-front vestibule, the deliberate compression before the reveal. Then the first atrium opens in front of you, and the spatial effect is immediate and calculated. A high ceiling, an opening in the roof called the compluvium, letting in a column of natural light. Directly beneath it, a shallow rectangular pool, the impluvium, collecting rainwater and reflecting sky. The walls are covered in first-style decorative plasterwork, imitating marble blocks in painted stucco. The floor is a mosaic of geometric patterns in black and white tesserae. In the center of the atrium, on a small pedestal, a bronze dancing faun, the statuette that gives the house its modern name. It was there in 79 AD. The original is now in the National Archaeological Museum in Naples. What you see on the site today is a replica. Beyond the first atrium, a second atrium, larger, more formal. Then the tablinum, the owner's office and reception room, where the family conducted business, received clients, displayed the wax portrait masks of distinguished ancestors in wooden cabinets. Beyond that, the first peristyle, a private garden surrounded on four sides by a colonnade of Doric columns. Fountains, carefully tended plantings, the sound of water. The transition from the street-level noise of the city to this interior silence was itself an architectural statement about the kind of power that could purchase quiet in a dense urban environment. And then, deeper still, the second peristyle, larger than the first. The garden here was essentially a private park. Excavations recovered evidence of formal plantings, gravel paths, garden sculptures. The famous Alexander mosaic, depicting Alexander the Great's defeat of the Persian king Darius at the Battle of Issus, composed of over 1.5 million individual tiles in 4 colors, covered the floor of the room that opened onto this garden. It is one of the most technically sophisticated mosaic works in the ancient world. It was a conversation piece, an assertion of cultural literacy, a declaration made in stone and glass paste that the family who lived here understood themselves as heirs to the entire sweep of Mediterranean civilization. Walk 3 blocks east. The houses get smaller, a single atrium, fewer rooms, plastered walls with simple painted bands rather than elaborate frescoes. These are the homes of the middle class, successful tradespeople, small-scale merchants, skilled craftsmen who owned their workshops and lived above them, comfortable by the standards of the ancient world, visibly, deliberately distinct from both the elite above them and the poor below them. In 1863, the archaeologist Giuseppe Fiorelli developed the technique of filling these voids with liquid plaster. The results were immediate and overwhelming in their human specificity. The plaster casts captured not just body position, but facial expressions, clothing folds, the positions of hands raised to cover faces in a final, instinctive gesture. A woman face down with her hands over her face. A man with his hand over his mouth. A family of 4, identified by their proximity and their positions as parents with 2 children, huddled together in a corner of a house on the Via dell'Abbondanza. A slave, identifiable by the iron ankle ring still in place on the cast. These are not abstractions. These are people. Specifically, individually, irreducibly, people, with names their casts do not carry, and histories their ash matrix cannot preserve, but with postures and positions and final decisions that 2,000 years have not erased. They died in a city that had underground heating systems and a meritocratic examination for public office and restaurant culture and professional sports media and pharmaceutical reference texts. They died in a city that was, by any objective measure, the most technologically and culturally sophisticated civilization on the planet in its hemisphere. They died because the most advanced human societies in history are not protected from geological events by their sophistication. The volcano does not distinguish between a slave in chains and a senator in a toga. the pyroclastic surge does not slow down for frescoes. For 1,700 years, Pompeii was lost. The location was known in a general sense, but the city was buried deep enough and the historical memory was fractured enough that systematic excavation did not begin until 1748, when the Bourbon king of Naples ordered exploratory digging at the site. What the excavators found was not ruins in the conventional sense. It was a city in suspension. Bread still in the ovens, carbonized but recognizable. Wine jars still sealed with their original stoppers. Frescoes in colors that had not been exposed to light or weather since 79 AD, preserving pigments that had faded and disappeared from every other surface in the Mediterranean world. Graffiti still sharp and legible. Shop signs still attached to their walls. The financial records of a banker named Lucius Caecilius Jucundus. 153 wax tablets recording loans, payments, and receipts dated between 52 and 62 AD, found in the strongbox room of his house, intact. The eruption that killed Pompeii also performed, inadvertently, the most comprehensive act of historical preservation in human history. The ash that suffocated the city also sealed it, protected it from the slow dissolution that destroyed every comparable Roman city that was not buried. Ostia, Rome's port city, survives as ruins, foundations, walls to varying heights, the outline of structures. Pompeii survives as a city. The difference is the volcano.